I'm really excited for this month's topic to dive into this one together because it's a big topic that we as Christian people need to wrestle with on a lot of occasions, whether it's teenagers or adult atheists or whomever's asking the question. It is frequently posed to Christians, why does a good God allow evil to exist in the world? October in the Purple Family of Faith books broadly focuses on the topic of creation. And so I wanted to focus on this specific aspect of creation for us here, since this is a common question that we go on together. We've talked, I'm sure, and we all have images and ideas of what the Genesis story looks like, but why does that Genesis story include the possibility of evil existing in the world? That's what I'd like to tackle this month, and I want to make room for your questions too. So if at any point in time you have questions, feel free to jot them down. We'll have a space at the end of the presentation for you to submit those questions to me so that we can spend more time on them in particular at a later date. All right, see, okay, hopefully this is presenting correctly now. Let me check to make sure the presentation is working. People, yeah, okay. So showing, hopefully now, not in Pear Deck, but just in the presentation screen. Tonight's meeting, because of an update we had to do with the cohorts, we have moved our cohort A folks. There were only a couple of families in cohort A, and they agreed to kind of merge with cohort B for the remainder of the year. So for family faith formation, this meeting right now is all online. Thank you for being online. First communion in person will still be in person next week. So if you've got a first communion kiddo, please join in that way in person if that's what you're signed up for. If you're online, you're still good to be online next week. And then likewise, we'll have cohorts A and B meet on October 28th, all together here in person, those who are doing that in person. I apologize for the confusion and the slight change to the schedule. Hopefully this allows us to have a slightly more balanced number group going into the future. Lastly, this is just my general advisory. Distance learning is kind of the backup plan in the event that we're advised to go to distance learning. Hopefully this is a good trial run tonight for that. And if any point in time you'd like to switch your mode of learning for your family from distance to in-person or vice versa, please let me know. Okay, so now my meeting slides should be aligned with Pear Deck. Pear Deck should be now showing the slide for the purpose of our parent meetings, which is, in this case, and for the whole year, to more fully help you develop your yes, your deep yes to God, and to increase the depth of that, to grow it over the course of the year. That's the purpose of adult formation. That's why we are gathered here. So hopefully you're on board for that, because that's what we're going to do, tackling this question this month. So let's just get right down to it then. Like I said, I'm going to try to stick more closely to the 7:05 end time than I have in the past. Here we go. So in October, we'll specifically focus on this question. All good God, evil in the world. These two things can seem contradictory to a lot of folks. It's not an easy topic, and it's not necessarily an easy answer, depending on how you try to approach this nut, how to crack this nut open. We're going to attempt to solve this problem by looking at what the Catechism says and breaking it open through these kind of 5-ish questions. Tonight we'll focus on, can a good and fair God allow evil to exist? And why would a good and fair God allow evil to exist? We'll talk about some different kinds of evil or senses of evil along the way, just to provide some clarity to our argument, because not all evil is the same. So we'll go about that next week. So when our in-person First Communion cohort is meeting in person, we'll talk about the problem of pain, the problem of unwarranted suffering that seems to happen without reason, like earthquakes, natural disasters. Are these things judgment from God, or are they just the world panning it out and God doesn't have anything to do with it? Why do these things happen? Why does God allow that kind of evil that doesn't seem to have a justification or a reason for it? And then lastly, our response among it. I'm kind of excited this month because October 28th, we have some free time. I haven't planned anything for that one yet. And later I'm going to give you an opportunity to vote on some ideas of what we can explore that night. Angels and demons is one topic, because we'll talk some about angels and demons tonight. There's also an opportunity for a pro-life speaker who's coming into town that night. And if we wanted to merge our parent meeting with that one and have everybody invited to that, That's an opportunity that lies ahead of us. So opportunities to vote on the direction for October 28th later on. Oops, make sure that button goes forward. Okay, so we're going to start with a Pear Deck question just to kind of get the brain juices flowing. I want to figure out what kind of background knowledge, how do you approach the problem of God and evil coexisting already? So let's begin by brainstorming what we already know about God and the problem of evil. So on your Pear Deck, you should have a pink slide now with a two-part question. What do you think God is? Not necessarily who do you think God is, but what is God? At its most basic level, what is God? And why do you think God allows bad things to happen? This is just your best answer, best guess. You could be spot on, and that would be great. If you're spot on, more power to you. If you're not spot on, that's okay. We're all here to grow and learn together. Frankly, none of us are ever quite all the way where we should be. So food for thought. Invite you, we're going to take just about a quick minute to add up some responses to this. I'll set the minute timer in a moment. God doesn't allow bad things to happen. To learn from our mistakes. We're all sinners at some point. Okay, elements of learning. And I don't know, I'm not quite sure on the first question how to respond to that myself. And I'd say like that idea that God allows us to learn from our mistakes is at least a relatively commonly held viewpoint. God allows evil to some extent is an idea. God doesn't allow bad things to happen. Perhaps God doesn't permit them. I don't want to put words in your mouth. And yet they happen anyways. I wonder why bad things would happen. So is a God who, for example, allows us to learn from our mistakes, is that, necessarily the right, the fair, and the good way to go about this? Seems like a pretty straightforward principle, but is that necessarily fair and good to allow evil to happen if you have the power to stop it? Let's get some definitions then straight first. This is where we're going to break open the Catechism and kind of dive in hard. This next section is going to be a lot of meat, kind of heavy theology stuff. So I invite you to check it out on YouTube after the fact if this gets, if I go through this too quickly. So what is God, right? How do we define God? The Catechism says that God is the fullness of being and of every perfection, without origin and without end. This roughly means that, and this is hard to express in language, God is being itself. God is like this, he is the act of being, and that is like totally self-contained. He does not depend on anything to exist, and without him, nothing else exists. He is like the sea from which all other beings arise. That is kind of what this next quote is saying, in that all creatures receive all that they are and have from God. And if God is perfection, if God is the sum total, not the sum total, but like if God is just this big perfect thing in which everything else is rooted, then God can't give something that is imperfect, I guess you might say. God can't give evil to something. God is being all goodness and being perfection in and of himself, doesn't give something, he doesn't give evil to it. He can only give goodness because that's who he is, and that's against his nature to give anything other than goodness. He alone is his very being, and he is of himself everything that he is. God has, and it's weird to say it this way, and again, forgive the mumbo jumbo theology thing, but there is no potential for change or improvement in God. God simply is. In the biggest, broadest sense, that's why we say that Jesus, or that God takes on to himself a human person in Jesus, rather than God became man. So we say became man in the creed. The Catechism goes into full detail to define that as God takes on our human being, because God himself doesn't change. God can't improve. He can't become better, and he can't become worse. He just simply is goodness in its most fundamental state. So if that's what God is, and if that's what the root of all goodness is, then what is evil versus God? The Catechism defines evil not as like this opposed force to God. Remember, God is like the basic thing, right? There is nothing more basic than God, and God is the root of all other things. Evil then is a privation or an absence of a good that ought to be there. So, for example, let's say I have a glass, or like somebody asks me for a glass of water, and I run over to the kitchen and I grab a glass and bring it back to them, and it's lacking water. They like that's a privation. It's an absence of a good that ought to be there. In a sense, it's a little kind of metaphor for what evil is, right? If goodness is a one, like a one, and then nothingness is a zero, evil is like saying, well, we're going to take a little bit off that one so that it's not everything that it should be. It is the absence of a good that ought to be there. Evil is roughly equivalent in this formulation to something not being whole or entire. If you are not whole or entire, then you're lacking a good that ought to be there. And that's what we refer to as evil in the Catholic tradition. Now, this manifests in two particular ways. For one, God has, according to the Catechism, freely willed to create a world in a state of journeying towards its ultimate perfection. In other words, the world is not perfect yet. The world's creation isn't quite done. God is still moving the world towards its perfection. And there are therefore goods in the world that ought to be there that aren't there. This is where we talk about like earthquakes, physical evil, disease. A lot of the disease, for example, would probably fall within this category. That is, the world has not more or less reached harmony yet. It has not settled down. An earthquake is that kills tons and tons of people is, quote, physical evil, because the world has not stabilized yet. And God has willed that the world does not exist in a stable state yet. More on this particular kind of evil next week. But angels and humanity have something different than the world. We're not just moving towards perfection. We have a free choice and the ability to love that allows us to move towards that perfection by our choice, or not to move towards that perfection. This is what comprises moral evil, is when we choose not to work towards the end that God has designed for us. Only, again, angels and mankind can do this kind of evil. Earthquakes don't cause moral evil because earthquakes don't necessarily have a choice in the matter. An important point on this that distinguishes Christianity from some other religions. If evil is a privation of the good, then the two are not equals, right? So think of that 1 and 0 that I said earlier. If nothingness is a 0 and goodness is a 1, and evil is like taking a slight chunk out of that 1, so that's like a 0.75 or whatever, then the sum total of God's goodness and the total of all good things outweighs, is bigger than, is greater than evil. There are not two competing forces in the universe, according to the Catholic theology of good and evil. There's goodness, there's God's goodness, and then there is rebellion against evil, or there's rebellion against God. And there's a good that is more fundamental than evil, and evil is something that exists as kind of this byproduct. It's not this kind of one way of reading the Taoist symbol, anyways, of two forces that are just locked in a perpetual creative combat with each other. Yes, God is fighting against evil, but God is always more good than evil can be at being evil. God wins from the start, just because God is bigger than all evil anyways. Which raises the question then, why would God allow evil to exist in the first place if God is just always bigger and more infinitely good than evil can be at evil? So this diagram I kind of created, try to summarize this, because I recognize this is a lot of William yammering for a bit. There's God at the bottom, right? God roots all things. All of these things on this chart are green because, like God, they derive their goodness from, they are good, like God. They derive their goodness from him. And yet these creatures are distinguished by those that have free will, freedom and will, the ability to choose, and those that don't have freedom and will, the ability to choose. Plants, animals, other creatures that don't have free will can't cause moral evil because they don't have the ability to choose. They can cause natural evil or physical evil, though, which basically just means that they are not yet in a state of perfection. And when you have a bunch of things that aren't perfect kind of living in the same space together, sometimes they just bump into each other wrong. And because they're not perfect, their imperfections just create more imperfections. So God has chosen to allow physical evil. Again, we'll talk more about that next time. But moral evil is going to be the focus of what we're talking about today, which is the kind of thing that is produced by angels and humans acting against their good. So notice all of these things are good. God did not create anything evil. All receive their goodness from God, angels and humans, earth, rocks, plants, stars, everything receives its goodness from God. All things depend on God. Again, they are rooted on God there at the bottom of the diagram. Evil does not ever occur in God, and there is nothing on God's level that is evil. Only good things exist at God's level. And not all things cause the same kind of evil. So this is a quick check. Just give a couple minutes on this one to finish before we get into the moral evil specifically. What makes moral evil different from physical evil? It might be lagging, so I don't know if we're going to do that. Great. Awesome. Thank you. Having freedom to choose or not. Exactly. That is the difference between physical and moral evil. One exists just because of the way the world not being perfect, and moral evil being of those creatures who choose to not be perfect, to creatures who can choose not to work towards their perfection. So tonight, we're going to focus on the remainder of the night anyways, the next 10 minutes, going to focus on moral evil and why God might allow moral evil to exist in this world. We'll address the problem of physical evil next week when we talk about suffering, because things like earthquakes and tornadoes and cancer and stuff like that fits more into the physical evil side of the world and why God would allow that. So again, moral evil tonight, a decision by a being to work against its own good. So back to the original question. Is a God that allows moral evil to exist a good and fair God? What good can possibly justify the existence of moral evil? The answer now, again, I'm going to cite from both the Bible and the Catechism because they both have a lot to say on the matter. If we think back to the nature of God, God is perfect in and of himself. He contains all goodness. He's a being in and unto himself on his own tier, on his own level. And the Bible tells us that God is love, that the ultimate goodness that grounds everything is love. Moreover, then, the Catechism tells us that out of love, God expresses who he is, expresses his desire by freely choosing to create the world. God, again, if he's this perfect thing, when we say perfect in this sense, we mean he needs nothing. He has no lack. He has no absence of anything. He is completely good enough in and of himself, God's self, to never need anything else. So when God chooses to create the world, it's just because he says, I want to. He has no compulsion, no need, no desire other than just, I want to do this. And so he creates the world freely, which means that his act of creation is free love, freely given love, an expression of free love that is God. Likewise, angels and humanity, thinking back to this earlier quote, have been given a capacity, being made in the image of God, humankind especially, being made in the image of God, have the responsibility, but also the opportunity to choose God. Like God, they can make a free choice to act in love, unlike other creatures. The deepest love that God has, God is the deepest love, means that God can choose freely. Likewise, humankind is allowed to choose freely to love God. Loving like God requires then a free will to choose God. Otherwise, we're not loving like God, we're loving like creatures. And so if God has called us to love as he loves, then we need to have a free will to choose to love like that. Boop, 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 too far. Freedom implies a choice. Remember, God didn't need to create the world, like I said a moment ago. God chose to create us and redeem us. He could have not, and he wouldn't have lacked anything for doing so. Instead, God just freely chose to do it. And likewise, we can freely choose to cooperate. We can freely choose whether or not to pursue the good that God has created us for. That means that the opportunity for moral evil is necessarily a part of what it means to live in a world where we can love like God, that is freely. If we can't love freely, we cannot love like God. And if we can't love freely, then there's no opportunity for moral evil either. So for this reason, it seems to us anyways, based on theology and the best things we can reason out, knowing that I'm not entirely an expert on this myself, God desired for us to love like him. And that was worth the risk of moral evil in God's eyes. God desires, and this is a Bishop Barron quote that I just love, God desires friends, not puppets. Original sin, then, in this context, is taking a little bit of our goodness out of us, right? Imagine if we were, when we had original goodness in the Garden of Eden, as the story goes, we were whole, we were entire, we were all good. We weren't missing anything. And we had the opportunity to freely love God, therefore, because we were not lacking anything in and of ourselves. Sin creates a lack in us. It creates a hole in our hearts that we cannot fill on our own. And that hole is original sin. Jesus Christ is God's answer to that, in that Jesus lived that original goodness without the hole in his heart. Jesus was created, well, not created because he's the Son of God, but Jesus takes on to himself, as I said earlier, human flesh, so that he can bring humanity back to its original goodness, a goodness without any privation, without any lack. And in doing so, he freely chose throughout his life, but especially in the moment of the cross, to love by giving himself totally, in the same way that God gives himself totally for creation. And this is to fulfill the good proper to him. In this way, Jesus lives out his whole life without experiencing and without causing any more privation, any more lack of goodness in the world, and instead becomes an example of goodness even unto his own death. The beautiful thing about this, of course, is that it's not the end of the story, right? This free love of Christ allows Jesus to partner with God and achieve victory. Jesus and God the Father working together, that achieves a victory over all of the lack and all of the weakness that is in humanity. All of our privation is overcome by Jesus Christ. He was the whole and entire human. So much so that even the ultimate privation of life, that is death, is overcome in Christ. If life is good, like 100%, that's the one on the spectrum, and that's the life is the goodness. Death is a reduction of that. It is a less good thing, which makes it evil. And Christ has overcome that and restored us to eternal life by his resurrection. And the result of this then further is that Christ invites us to follow him, to take on his life, his whole and complete and entire life, on and to live as he lives, practicing this heartfelt compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. This is one of my favorite passages from Colossians. To put on the love that is God, that free gift love, and to imitate Jesus in loving that way. To let that guide us and to lead us in this life as we are growing into full humans as Christ does, as Christ is. Great. Way to hang in there. Thank you for that. I get excited about this even if I can't talk super well about it all the time. So let's wrap up and summarize real quick. I'm going to throw up a question on the board. Well, not actually throw up, but I'm going to put up a question on the screen, another Pear Deck question. So List 3 things, quick like, just that you learned today or encountered today. Maybe some of this is old news to you. Maybe it's all new to you. If it's all new and it was totally overwhelming, I encourage you to check out the recording afterwards. But 3 things that you learned today, incomplete sentences, because my teacher brain is like, please complete sentences. I'm impressed with the response rate tonight, guys. Great. Thank you for responding so much. Cool. Thank you. Unlock those screens. Let folks finish some thoughts first, and then basically I've just got announcements for the remainder of the evening. Some pretty cool ones and important ones, and a chance to vote on topics for the end of the month. Okay. So I'm going to move on. Thank you for your responses. I appreciate your thoughtful look onto things, and I'm glad to know that the idea that like good and evil is not equal is a good thought, because that's easy to lose in the world today. So what lies ahead for the week? First Communion, or not the week, the month. First Communion will meet next week in person, 6:30 p.m., 7:45. Everyone else will be online that day. We'll be talking about physical evil and unwarranted suffering. If the result today was that God chose to allow moral evil because it allows us to love like him, why on earth would God allow evil that we don't get to choose to exist? You know, it's just there. So we'll talk about that next week. Some options for our October 28th meeting, which will again be cohorts A and B in person and everyone else online that day. Do we want to talk about angels and demons? Because yes, it's almost Halloween and that's kind of spooky, but yes, these are a real thing, part of our faith, and lots of folks have questions about them. We can also talk about creationism, 7 days. Did God really do the whole thing in 7 days? And what does the church teach about that? We could also talk about, or there's a pro-life speaker who will be in town that day if we want to go and join up with that. Or we can just spend some time unpacking your questions on God and evil, not just good and evil. How those two are related, can they coexist? I'd love to spend some time on that, so go ahead and vote on one of those options over there in the corner. Probably, I got 3 of 11 responses, 4 of 11, 5 of 11, cool, 6 of 11. As if you need me counting up while they're probably showing up there on your screen. Okay, now you'll have the opportunity to vote on this again next week. I'd encourage you to vote twice if you want, just because it's next week will be a second vote on this. Some other things to keep in mind. Please make Flipgrid responses a priority. I know it's on the checklist. It's kind of a different weird thing, but I've really loved being able to respond to the folks who have responded in their Flipgrid assignments. So please, if you haven't done September's, I'd encourage you to check that out. Really cool event, 40 Days for Life, that's been going on at our parish, has a national level speaker, Dr. Pat Castle, talking about pro-life activism and how we can work to end abortion on this Friday, 6:30 p.m. over here at the Family Life Center gym. So please check that out. If you're able to, it promises to be a really cool event. I'll also be setting up a live stream for it on our Facebook page. So if you can't join in person and you're interested, we'll get that going there. And lastly, today is the memorial of Our Lady of the Rosary. We remember today a victory of a Christian fleet in the Mediterranean against an invading Turkish army that probably would have laid waste to Europe, but the people, the Christian fleet was encouraged first and foremost above all things to pray. And so like before the whole battle and for like months beforehand, the Pope called everybody to pray the rosary. And at just the right moment during the battle, it seems, so the story goes, the wind changed and an outnumbered fleet defeated a huge enemy and thus saved Christendom. Quite a crazy story, but the power of the rosary is real. So I encourage you, my wife and I are starting a rosary novena tonight. I encourage you to pray a rosary or a decade of the rosary with your family tonight to join into that. Our Lady is a wonderful, powerful intercessor for us in our fight against evil, so please consider joining in there. This is my last slide. If you still have any questions about God and the existence of evil, I'd encourage you to articulate them here now. If not, don't worry, we'll have this question again next week, and once you've written that up, I hope you have a blessed, wonderful rest of your evening. See you next week.